Hello and welcome to blog number 76, me learning to play the Melodeon. It's been quite a long while since I've done one of these. I think the last one was early 2018. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what my experienced self would say to my inexperienced self if he could talk to him back in 2011 when I was first starting to play. This is a bit of a disclaimer before we get into it. I mean, this is based on my experience, which is fairly limited to, like I say, 8 years. But I have crammed a lot in that time. Lots of learning, lots of teaching, playing with the Morris side, lots of YouTube videos. But like I say, this is my experience. You know, your experience might turn out to be different, and by all means, you know, seek out other people's advice. This is basically what I would say to myself if I could go back in time and advise myself before I started learning and playing. I say experienced self because that's all relative, because there are some players who have, you know, upwards of 40, 50, maybe even 60 years of playing, and so obviously their perspective will be very different to mine. But this might help you if you're starting out or considering playing the Melodeon and you want a bit of a heads up on some pitfalls that you might encounter in those early days. What I'm basically saying here is don't take this as chapter and verse, just one person's ideas about, you know, things you might encounter. A little bit of background before we get started. I'm not going to go into any detail here because I've covered all this extensively elsewhere. Just to say that I'm a professional musician, now retired, and when I took up the Melodeon, I've been teaching the guitar in schools and elsewhere, private lessons, and playing in bands for over 40 years. So I had no experience of squeeze box instruments. I fancied trying it, I loved it, and as they say, the rest is history. Right, this is in no particular order, but just a few thoughts for you here. When you start off, pick a box that's right for you in terms of weight, sound and size. I still play my Castanari Lily, which is a lovely little Melodeon that I bought at the end of 2016. It's light and it's easy to play. It's great for studio work and my lessons. I wouldn't say it's a particularly good Morris box, although there are people that do use it for Morris. But it's a really comfortable little box to play, and I wouldn't be without it. This is definitely my go-to box for most of the stuff I do. The box that I use, and notice the use of the word box, you may not be familiar with that, but that's what most Melodeon players call their instruments. The box I use for Morris is this Dino Buffetti Binchi, which, okay, I'm not crazy about the sound here in my studio, but for Morris it's great, it's loud, it cuts through and it seems to blend well with other Melodeons. But it is a bit heavier. It's got 2 reeds per button as opposed to 1 reed per button that the Lily has, so it's obviously that much heavier. It is a nice box, very easy to play, but you know, I'm not crazy about the sound, like I say. I've had quite a few Melodians over the years that were too big, too heavy for me, including Sauterelle, Connemara 3, a big old Roland FR18 electric Melodeon. I sold those and I didn't regret getting rid of them in the end, but I kind of bought them in ignorance and in error. I'm not a particularly strong person, so you know, if you're a big strong guy or big strong lady, then you might well manage a heavy Melodeon, but for me I found them pretty uncomfortable and they hurt me, you know, quite quickly. Make sure you buy a good box to start with. If you buy something off eBay which is a wreck, it's not going to exactly encourage you to play. If it's got lots of faults, horrible noises, notes out of tune, make sure you get a fettled box, and that means an expert, someone like Martin White or Theo Gibb. They have had a look at it and they've corrected all the faults. Most of these Melodians have got faults and they need sorting out by an expert. And if you get a fettled Melodeon, you're going to have a really good head start. If you've got something that's wheezing and making horrible noises, it's not exactly going to give you a great start. Next bit of advice is don't give in to MAD. And if you don't know what MAD is, it stands for Melodeon Acquisition Disease. And this is where you start with one Melodeon. I started with this Hona Erica here. and then you rapidly decide you need 2, 3, 4. Before you know it, you've got 7, 8. Some people have got, far more than that. And it is a bit of a disease amongst Melodeon players, like it is amongst guitar players, and I can vouch for that as well, being a guitarist. I rapidly got into that, ended up having a whole row of them. I've still got quite a few, I must say, but I've kind of whittled it down to the ones that I really need and really like. You rapidly convince yourself when you start that, this Hona Erica that you begin with is not man enough for the job, and you want a really expensive, super fast, super smooth Castanari or Sauterelle, which obviously is going to cost you a lot of money. You really only need 2 or 3 Melodeons. Obviously this depends on how many different styles that you play, but if you're a Morris player, you probably only need 1, maybe 2 DG Melodeons, 2-row like this. You don't need tons and tons of boxes, but obviously it's up to you and how much money you have to spend on the things, but you can get trapped into that very quickly. My advice is, tread warily. Get one, stick with it for a while. If you really feel like you need to spend more money and you can, then by all means do, but watch out for the dreaded mad. There are lots of different types of Melodeons. Some have 2 rows, like this one on the treble side. Some have 1, some have 3. So what do you need? My advice would be to start with a 2-row, like this one, and with 8 basses. You might think, well, a 1-row, surely that's easier, isn't it? But actually, you're going to find it quite limiting, and you might find it actually harder to play. Start with a 2-row DG Melodeon like mine would be my best advice to you, especially if you're going to play for Morris. I've got a couple of 3-row Melodeons, and yes, you can get more notes, but they tend to be, I've found anyway, a little bit soulless. Part of the joy and the appeal of the Melodeon is the kind of cut and thrust, the push and pull. And of course with a 3-row, yes, of course you can do that, but you tend to play across the rows and it tends to end up being a little bit soulless, dare I say it. Obviously in an expert's hands that's not true, but in a beginner's hands maybe that is. So don't forget, this is just my advice. It may not be the best advice, but it's what I would suggest. Ignore the 1 rows, ignore the 3 rows, get a 2-row. By 2-row I mean 2 rows on the right hand side of notes to play tunes, and 8 bass buttons, chords and bass notes. Ignore the 3-row and 1-row at first, and maybe, like me, you can move to, I'll give you my experience. I started off with a 2-row, and I decided it would be a great idea to get 3 rows, not do too much pushing and pulling because it was hurting my shoulders, and that was because my technique was wrong. And so I had 1, 2, 3 of those before I knew it, and developed this cross-row style which wasn't correct for Morris, and ended up having to change my style completely when I joined a Morris side. So watch out for that. Probably the 2-row is the best one to start with. By the way, with 3-row Melodeons, be careful when you're buying them, because there's a world of difference between a 3-row, which is A, D and G. That's 1 row is in the key of A major, 1's in the key of D major, 1's in the key of G major, and what they call a D, G, AC, which is 1 row D, 1 row G, and 1 row of accidentals. Very, very different boxes. Like I say, if you're unsure, steer clear of both of those until you gain more experience. And maybe if you do want a 3-row, possibly the D, G, AC, DG with accidentals is probably the way to go, rather than an A, D and G. And I've covered all this elsewhere in my blogs. I've gone through the ADG box, the 3-row box, quite extensively elsewhere, so watch out for that if you want to know more about that particular type of Melodeon. Now, if you're into English folk music, I would advise you to join a Morris side as quickly as you can. Most Morris sides will be, welcoming. They may say to you, "We'll come to practices until you can actually play something, and then you can, play out with us." It depends on how desperate they are for a Melodeon player. Most Morris sides have got, you know, one or two, maybe three very experienced players and a couple of novices waiting in the wing, so you can be one of those novices. And it's a great way to get the whole experience of folk music, Morris dancing. It's great fun to go and play out and meet other Morris sides, and generally you're going to be well received all around the country, and I'm talking about the country of England where I live. Obviously there are Morris sides around the world. Playing on your own, I did that for quite a few years. It's a little bit soul destroying, not quite so bad for me because obviously I was doing my YouTube videos, but when you start playing with other musicians, you learn so much. It gives you the incentive to get better, and for me it meant, you know, playing the Morris stuff properly rather than my weird 3-row style. So I found it very, very useful and learnt a lot from my fellow Morris musicians. Next bit of advice is don't try and be the next Andy Cutting. Now, if you don't know who I'm talking about, check him out on the internet. He's a very, very fine English Melodeon player with his own distinctive style. He's an amazing player. He's been playing donkey's years, although he's actually not that old. I think he's only still in his 40s at the time of doing this video. When I first started, I bought his album, his solo album, and made up my mind that, oh yeah, I definitely want to play all the tunes off the album. But to be honest, they are pretty difficult, and if you're a beginner, you're going to find them nigh on impossible. The Abyss is the tune that he wrote that a lot of people play. I can play that one. It took a lot of figuring out, but to be honest, when you're starting, I would really avoid trying to play things like that. There's a real wealth of English folk and dance tunes out there you can learn that sound great, and they're nowhere near as complicated as that. And if you want to hear some of those, go to my website. The address is on your screen now, and you can hear me play. Well, I've got, at the time of doing this video, about 133, 134 of those up, and you can hear me playing those tunes. And obviously all over YouTube there's examples of people playing those famous tunes like Princess Royal, Speed the Plough, Constant Billy. You know, there's loads of them, and they're not ridiculously hard, and they're a good way to get in. But I would start in a simple way to, you know, at first, you know, do your Speed the Ploughs and things like that to start with, Drunken Sailor, maybe even nursery rhymes. And one of my lessons, one of my free lessons on the web is for Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, which you might laugh at, but it's actually a really good way to start to understand how this thing works. So start simple, progress slowly, and then maybe a few years in you can start tackling some of the Andy Cutting type pieces. He's not the only one, of course. There are other amazing players out there. There's a young guy called Ben Swift, who I'm a big fan of. I mean, I think he's only about 19 or 20 now. Ridiculous player. He plays really complicated things. There's loads of complex things if you want to learn them, but I'd steer clear of those at first. You know, walk before you can run. Now, there is a website which is called Melnet for short, and it's www.melodeon.net, and that address is on your screen now. And it's an amazing website for Melodeon players all around the world with a wealth of resources. You can buy and sell your instruments on there, you can learn tunes on there, all kinds of things. And it is wonderful, but you can spend an awful lot of time on there. And it's time that you could spend practicing. I must admit, in the first few years, I used to spend hours and hours on there, you know, trawling through videos and documents and one thing and another. And I mean, I wouldn't be without it. It's a great resource run by Theo Gibb, who I mentioned earlier, and Clive Williams. And, you know, there are lots of contributors. I'm one of them on there. But when I think about all the hours that I have spent on there, I'm not saying it was wasted time, but I could have been spending that time practicing. So, you know, it's a bit like eBay, isn't it? You know, you spend hours looking at eBay and stuff on there, and it's a bit of a waste of time. Facebook, all these things are great in their way, aren't they? And just be, you know, aware of the fact that all those hours you could be practicing, and that's far more useful to you as a beginner player. Now the whole point of folk music and the Melodeon is, there's loads of ways of doing it. So do what suits you. If you want to learn pieces by ear, well, that's great. If you want to use sheet music, you want to read the music from the Melodeon, that's great too. Don't let anyone tell you, oh yeah, you've got to read music or you've got to learn by ear. I would say that if you're going to play out with a Morris side or play in any sessions, you need to learn the pieces off by heart. You can't really stand there with the music stand, although I have seen that. So that is an important thing. But either of those methods, learning by ear or learning from tablature, diagrammatical versions of the music or music, sheet music itself, that's fine as well. There's no right or wrong way. If you want to use 4 fingers like I do on the left hand, that's great. If you want to use just 3, that's great. If you want to use just 2, that's okay. I wouldn't advise just using 1, but any of those is fine. And again, it's what suits you. I advise using 4, but that's just me. That's the way I learned. Not right from the beginning. I started with 3, moved to 4, but that just works for me. I've got very long, slender fingers. It might not work for you, but be aware there are different ways, and you can't say that any of them are right or wrong. It's what suits you. See, some players wear 2 straps over their shoulders. Some wear 1. Some don't wear any. I use 2. But again, you'll find what's comfortable for you, and stick with that. One thing I would say is spend a lot of time getting your straps right, because getting comfortable is, a big percentage of being successful with this thing. If the thing's slipping off your shoulder or it just doesn't feel right, you're going to get uncomfortable very quickly and you're not going to want to play. So get those straps right. I spent many hours, many days until I, came up with something that worked for me. Don't be swayed by people on the internet who you perceive to be expert. They may well be experts on the Melodeon, but their methods may not suit you. Like I say, you'll come up with something that works for you, and I would advise you to stick with that. Don't be averse to change. If somebody says to you, I reckon if you tried that, and that happened to me, I started off and I was doing a few things wrong, and a few people on Melnet suggested to me, try this, and I did, and I was glad. And some things I tried and they didn't work for me. Don't be averse to change, but don't keep chopping and changing, because it's going to be detrimental to your progress. Try and find something that works and stick with it. As far as practicing goes, I would practice regularly. Every day is a great idea, but don't go on for too long. When I first started, I was really gung-ho for it. I was practicing hours and hours on end, and ended up hurting my shoulders because I was very tense and my technique wasn't correct. I was yanking the bellows left and right, and very quickly injured myself and had to actually stop for quite a few days until my body had repaired itself. So practice often, but in short bursts, okay? Otherwise, injuries will occur, RSIs will occur, and then you'll become discouraged. When you do practice, make sure you are relaxed. Have a cup of tea. I've got one going here. Or a cup of coffee, and take your time. There's no rush. Drop those shoulders, relax, breathe. If it's starting to go horribly wrong, stop, walk away, come back later that day or another day. Do take your time, but do, be cool about it, relax. If you get all tensed up, I've got to get this right, I've got to get this right, it's going to be the road to failure. And I must admit, I was really into it, because it was such a change for me from having played the guitar all my life to playing this weird squeeze box thing that had, different notes on the push and the pull. I was fascinated by it, and my enthusiasm kind of ran away with me, and I ended up kind of injuring myself quite quickly. So watch out for that. It's supposed to be fun playing this thing, although you might not think that if you stumble upon some sessions in pubs. It's still a bit of a mystery to me. I've been in pubs where there's been a session on, and if you don't know what I mean, it means lots of players playing together, mainly Melodians, but there's concertinas and all kinds of instruments, and sometimes they look so miserable I wonder why they're doing it. But anyway, that's a topic for another video. It's supposed to be fun. If you're not enjoying it, it might mean you're uncomfortable or you're not playing the kind of music that you want to. Not everybody wants to play Morris. You might want to play just, basic nursery rhymes or pop songs. It's possible to play pop music on this instrument. If you're not happy, you're not enjoying it, it might not be the instrument for you. You might just think, well, yeah, perhaps this isn't for me. Try a concertina or try something else. But it's supposed to be fun, and if you're not enjoying it, like I say, you need to examine what is actually wrong. The DG Melodeon is great for Morris, but it's quite high-pitched. Some of the notes on the G row go very, very high, very squeaky. You might be better off with a lower-pitched instrument like a B-flat, E-flat, or an AD. I've got those, and they're the same, essentially, just lower-pitched. And, if I had a choice, I would play a B-flat, E-flat. I much prefer the lower pitch sounds, but it just so happens that the DG is the instrument, the weapon of choice, as we say, for Morris. But I would much prefer it if we played in a lower key. And if you don't like the high pitched DG, try a lower pitched instrument. Now, if Irish traditional music is your bag, as we used to say back in the 60s, maybe a BC instrument would be better, and that means one row is in the key of B, one row is in the key of C, or C and C sharp. They're called semitone boxes because the two rows are a semitone apart. You might get on better with one of those and may not worry about the bass. A lot of people who play B, C, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, those semitone boxes, a lot of people don't even play any basses, or they play basses, here and there. It's a different style of playing, not something I know anything about at all. My friend Steve Jones is the go-to guy for that, so check him out on Melodeon.net. He's a really good player, and he could give you much better advice than I. But like I say, that's probably the best box for Irish traditional music, although it is perfectly possible to play Irish music on the DG. I can play a few, and there's a guy called Tim Eady who plays Irish music on a DG Melodeon, and he plays it brilliantly. So it is possible, but you need the right instrument generally for the kind of music that you like. What about lessons? Well, you might get on better with a private tutor. Obviously it's expensive, more expensive than buying a book or a course. There are plenty about. Look on Melnet. There's a page of tutors. I'm on there amongst loads of others, so find the one that's in your area, try and get some recommendations for them, and if you can afford it, possibly private lessons is the way to go. You might only need a handful of lessons to get started, but obviously I'm going to plug my lessons here. I've got loads of video lessons, and they're all available on my website. Basically I taught myself with the help of a few hints, like I said, from people on Melnet. But basically I'm self-taught, but I'm a professional musician, so I had a bit of a head start, I guess. If you've never played an instrument at all, you might, do well getting at least, half a dozen lessons from somebody who knows what they're doing. The truth is, you've never learnt all there is to know about playing a musical instrument. I've been playing the guitar since I was 6, and I'm 66 now, and I'm still really scratching the surface, if I'm honest. And obviously I've been playing the Melodeon for 8 years, and although I've learnt quite a lot in that time, I'm sure there's loads and loads and loads still to learn. So there we are, a few pearls of wisdom, such as they are, and you can take them with a pinch of salt, or you can take them to heart and learn from them. It's up to you, of course, and of course you feel free to disagree with what I've said. But I hope you found this video useful. If you're starting out or thinking about learning to play the Melodeon, I wish you lots of luck. It's a great instrument, incredibly addictive, and if you get into it, it'll keep you occupied for many, many years to come. Thank you very much for watching, and you'll see me in my next video.